I actually did it. I only pray I'm not too late.
Excellent. Yes. I can already feel the energy coursing through every vein in my body.
The best Rupture team is these 4 IDs, in this deployment order, with these support passives. Yeah, I know. I normally save it to the end of the video, and the reasons why will be there as usual, but Rupture is an odd team, and given that no relevant IDs will be mentioned for around 30 straight minutes, I felt leading with that might help. Rupture itself has gone through 3 eras, for lack of a better word, of viability. From just a pile of good IDs, like every launch team, to a gimmicky, if viable build that actually got an ID nerf, to Heishou hell. I'm, as always, doing this in chronological order, which means starting with the sad pile that is launch Rupture IDs. Just look at this, man, this was a triple O. Somehow, despite the only Rupture count on a launch ID being LCCB-ish, Greg thinks he's important enough to have a 4-coin S3 that wants the target to have count after the first 3 coins. I don't know if he counts as a tank ID, given he both has obscene self-healing, uncapped too, but also has -2 defense level, 3 stagger thresholds, and sub 200 HP. Honestly, the only good aspect of G-Corp, aside from the support passive, was being the least bad Greg ID to carry Leisure Domain. Probably the second best ego until Threadspin 4, and still a good ego to this day. Luckily, Greg does actually get a much better Rupture ID later, although nothing spectacular. As for the 3 other launch options, we have LCCB-ish, who while definitely good at the time, has nothing to really mention here. The S3 is just a good Rupture tool, and the rest of her kit sucked. Then, 7 Heishou, who is probably the best launch 00 overall, and has a single Rupture infliction in her kit. 7E is the closest in design to an actual Rupture ID of the bunch, and most of that came from Upside 4. He's also the weakest of the 3, still can't sustain Rupture, and his only notable moment was being best in slots against the Snakes in Railway 1, given he had a 5 to 7 speed range and 3 pierce fragility. That is all, but the 7 IDs will be brought up again later, in passing. 7 Autis was our first Autis 00, and honestly, she was fine, if not pretty good for the time. I'm not going to waste time on Upside 3 kits anymore, so here we go. The first skill that actually goes positive on Rupture count, on an ID with Ebony Stem. Her clashing was great for the time, but she's heavily outdated by modern standards, and describing her replacement as power creep is like comparing Liu Mer to Thumb Mer. As for Ebony Stem, it's a hell of an ego, or rather, a hell of an ego passive. It's expensive, and the He itself is pretty average, but if you Superbia it out, or just manage to pay the 10 resource cost, you get uncapped access to bind and Rupture counts, with the small issue of it being next turn. Moving on, given the complete lack of other Season 1 Rupture, is Sun Shower, who will be skipped again, and Rose Greg. While horrifically overshadowed by the other 2 Season 2 Rupture 00s in one way or another, he was a shockingly long steadfast in Rupture, given his strict +1 count S2, potential +1 count 3 coin S3, and his Gluttony Guard? Yeah, that one will come up later, but he's been utterly obliterated by the death of a certain other ID, on top of a near strict upgrade. What is it with Rupture making good 00s? Then, on the next week, we got AEDD Gregor, and now I'm starting to believe that half of Rupture fans are just free-to-plays, given it was free. This one might not look like much, but all you need to know is that from his 6 resource cost, you got 10, 15 once Upside 4 arrived, conditional Rupture counts. All you needed to do was use Gloom skills, and you'd be fed an obscene amount of sustain for the stack, while also feeding charge count for the generic IDs you were still pressed to run. While nowhere near as important these days, Rupture still has a decent chunk of Gloom, so you might still get value from it, if you deploy Greg. Next, Sloshing Ishmael. Finally, the Rupture banner, featuring the only banner 00 completely overshadowed by its 00, K-Corp Hong Lu. He's bad. This shouldn't be a big surprise, I don't think anyone's actually ran him in ages, and even at release, it was mostly Cope keeping him afloat. Simply put, why waste time on a tank when that tank does nothing to keep the rest of your team alive? As an actual ID though, K-Corp Hong Lu's issues are pretty obvious. He has low coin counts, awful infliction, and bad conditions. You already know who to replace him with though. Talisman Sinclair is also an utterly awful ID. In fact, he's one of the worst 00s in the game. His whole gimmick is consuming Rupture count to inflict more potency. His rolls are all bad with literally 0 conditionals, and there's little to say about him past his support being okay. Well, to address the elephant in the room, yeah, Talisman used to be a very different ID. As one of the only IDs to ever be nerfed, and the only one to actually be interesting, I'll go over what changed. Thankfully, it's not too difficult to explain. Talisman was the only real difference, with the current version being an actual debuff, while the prior version was, in essence, a tier 3 ego gift. Inflicting Rupture on hit and when hit equal to the value is self-evidently great, and helped by an ID that will be brought up quite a bit later. The only other change was arguably a buff, in that his support passive went from applying twice the highest resonance talisman to the ally with the most HP while at 4 gluttony resonance, to a fairly standard +1 to infliction at 4 owned gluttony. These might not sound like major nerfs, but it's impossible to overstate how much these nerfs killed him. Rupture's biggest issue, more than any other status, has been sustaining the stack, given how stingy PM is with Rupture counts. Talisman was always good as a way to sidestep this, letting you keep a small free stack once you shifted it with the S3. Now, Talisman serves as a great way to gut your Rupture damage by letting you turn 1 Rupture count to 1 to 3 potency, made even worse by the fact that hitting that 3 potency causes Talisman to fall off at turn end. I do also, as one last footnote, want to mention Talisman's uptime 4. Nowadays it's entirely normal, with it just being some fairly normal increases to his ramp up, and slightly more count on the S3. At the release of Uptime 4, however, it was an actual nerf, with it buffing his S3 to apply 7 Talisman. You know, the status that expires at 6+. Just stunning work all around on this ID. Given that, however, this is still the most relevant Rupture Claire ID, as a support passive admittedly, I'll go over his ego here. Branch of Knowledge sucks. It's still easily the best design for any Rupture Sinclair, just given the 12 Rupture potency on heads hit. That said though, I hate this thing. It's got an awful passive, the majority of the power is on the coin, and if you do heads it, you're spending 20 SP for a pretty mediocre ego. The people calling it awful are definitely letting their biases talk, because there's no mode where you don't run it on any team that wants Rupture conditionals, but it also hurts to use, so eh. Lantern is a fine healing ego, with a bit of Rupture and a really nice overclock. It's got the unfortunate trade-off of on-hit healing, making its use against most bosses limited, but the side effect is making it an absurdly efficient healing tool with the weight condition met. The passive is also fine, there's not much to say honestly, it's just a good option to run. Tears the Tarnished Blood, in comparison, is an interesting suicide ego, and one that has a lot to mention. To start, it's an extremely efficient tool. In Rupture, with how free Gluttony is no matter how you build your team, the cost is effectively a mere 2 Lust and 2 Pride, and given it's a modern war, it's got a cheap 10 SP cost up front. The passive is fine, with the first effect triggering constantly but not doing much, while the second effect rarely triggers in a meaningful way. The ego itself, however, is far more impressive. Denial effectively forcing the ego to resolve is incredible, and while it triggering does guarantee sync dies, the ego has a payoff for that. Just keep in mind the passive didn't turn on until the turn after you use the ego for the first time. As for the other effect, Flower Burying Pin is pretty minor, being a pittance of offense level that takes an Aeon to actually stack up, but complaining about it would just be petty. It exists to set up the actual ego. It's just a big high damage war, as you'd expect, except trading off a bit of weight in Clashing 4, assuming Sync's got all of his conditionals, a 3-coin 35 roll with up to 60% bonus damage on the last coin. Now, in comparison to some other wars, that might not sound all that impressive, but given the damn high roll on top of those damage conditionals, it ends up hitting on par with things like Don's overclocked Yearning Makala, and only really gets beaten by the 2 hardest hitting wars, those being Honglu's Tarnished Blood and Greg's Unbrilliance. The corrosion is worse, not worth the effort, and the only upsides it has is being able to provide twice as much pin. This isn't worth the insultingly high SP and resource costs, and turning the passive on same turn. I guess that if 1 fragile next turn is absolutely mandatory, it's not an awful idea, but that seems like a niche scenario. Moving on, I'm going to be skipping the faux Rupture IDs, as you may have already noticed. To clarify, that's every ID that I personally feel has no relevance to Rupture, given they've got another keyword, and no skills that are even count neutral. So, that means we get 2 actual Rupture IDs, in 7 Heath, and then 7 Faust. Heath has a pretty simple purpose. He inflicts potency. For some effect, this would honestly be great, especially considering that at the time of his release, Bleed and Tremor didn't really exist, and Burn was barely playable. Sadly, Rupture doesn't really want an ID who only inflicts potency, and he only really got to hang around for as long as he did due to a complete lack of competition for several banners. I'd say more, but he's one of the least interesting double O's. He wants a full 7 association team, but that team was never relevant, and the only boost was to Heath's potency infliction, not his count, and also not any other ID. Heath also has no relevant Rupture ego, so that'll at least make it quicker to get to the good ID on that banner. 7 Faust is, unfortunately, in a pretty similar spot to 7 Heath, with her having better damage, but actually somehow worse infliction, even for count. Her kit is pretty standard, with double coin power conditionals, entirely standard numbers, and the only odd part of the kit is the thrice per turn haste on the guard. I can't imagine that part ever being a problem if you could get 4 triggers a turn, but who cares? Oh, and because it's the last ID with it, I'll quickly go over weakness analysed. It's pretty simple, thankfully. It's inflicted as next turn, and then just increases the damage type, not sin type, resistance of 1 times or lower by plus 0.2. This is inconsistent, but it'll pretty much always do something. None of Faust's ego was relevant at the time of 7's release, and you all already know about her replacements. So, this means that the next ID is W Corp E, who's an interesting one, but also still not all that relevant to current teams. His kit is underwhelming, with low coin counts, double O rolls, and slightly positive infliction off of his S2 and S3. Dimensional Rift just being a downgraded version of next turn Rupture, on top of a gimmicky evade, and a passive that can let him roll reasonably well on speed, on top of passing out charge barrier when spending charge. Not all that relevant here, but nice to have. The only real reason to consider him is his ego, and more specifically, Dimension Shredder. I've been pretty harsh on this ego before, and there's several pretty clear reasons, but it should hopefully suffice to say that the ego itself sucks. On any non-charge ID, it's straight up neg 6 count ego, with no weight, low damage, and a forced target in regular encounters. The corrosion is similarly bad, getting slightly higher damage and 6 potency, but that's not enough to make up for its 10 resource cost when overclocked. No, the only reason this ego is given any attention is the passive. The 4 charge count on self when not taking damage is barely relevant even on W Corp, but allowing skills of 3 or less coins to be count neutral, if not notably positive, is a really nice boost. However, please keep in mind the 3 limitations of the ego, especially in regards to an ID that will be mentioned later. First, you need to have actually spent both the 25 SP and 6 resources on the ego, which means barring Superbia, you'll be popping it turn 2 at the earliest. While 3 sloth isn't difficult, getting 3 in 1 turn is. Secondly, you do actually need to outspeed the target. Again, not a major ask, but we do have multiple enemies with fixed speeds or actual haste, and many of those can easily roll faster than even E's fastest ID. Third, it's a strict 3 times per turn, not per skill, not per enemy, but 3 triggers a turn. This means weight, high coin count skills, and especially high coin count weighted skills will still be count negative. We're on a decent streak for IDs, and that continues with Lantern Dawn. Those of you who've watched a few of these before might be bracing for me to go off about the issues Double O's have, about how I hate this ID, and how they were barely relevant. Well, this might be a surprise, but I'll happily admit, yeah, Lantern Dawn is good. Her rolls suck, she's a tank with poor stagger thresholds, and her ego are abhorrent, but none of that matters, given that for the time she was released, she was the most count positive ID Rupture had, with consistent gluttony access. I don't have much to say about her, given she was pretty bland. All her uniqueness was around her being a HP regen tank. Oh, there was that one bug, I guess. As for ego, the only relevant one is Red Sheet, and calling it relevant is a generous description. For this ego to do anything, you need a 6+ gluttony res, and then to have a decently rolling skill go after Dawn to trigger Twisted Curse Talisman. The payoff? Best case, 4 Rupture potency and 1 Rupture count, along with a garbage passive. The overclock is slightly better, mostly due to only needing a 4+ gluttony res, and sometimes triggering the talisman itself, but the actual payoff for some reason isn't any better there. I don't know why the caps are so absurdly low, but I don't care enough about this ego to want to change. Unfortunately, it's now time for one of the worst Rupture IDs, Dead Rabbit Mer. He's like Lantern Dawn, except with no healing, no aggro, slightly better conditionals, and then turning all the Rupture count into potency, on an ID with a 5+ Rupture count conditional. He does have a count neutral S2, but given that it needs a 6-5 stack to clash at the usual 16 baseline, it's not that relevant. Thankfully, Mer has a way better ID next season, who'll be given a decent spotlight. Our next ID, released half a year later, was definitely worth the wait. Deviat Rodion was easily one of the most crucial parts of Rupture, from her release all the way to the death of Talis Claire, and it's pretty simple to explain why. Her kit might seem like a mess of keywords, conditions and caps, but it's actually reasonably simple to explain. You get the target to a 15-3 Rupture stack, you trigger a 4+ Gluttony Resonance, and then 5 out of 6 of Rodion's skills account neutral, have major potency infliction, and all hit pretty hard. The exception, her S3, still consumes count, instead just dealing a massive amount of damage with, assuming we have enough count for the stack to not fall off, a universal plus 90% damage, a 29 roll on 4 coins, and plus 25% more damage on those last 2 coins. Now, there were some real limitations for Deviat Rodion, mostly around 3 issues, of which I'll bring up 2 right now. Not only was Rodion under an incredibly strict time limit, but she needed to have the highest HP of all your IDs to keep herself as the main talisman target. Given that talisman deals damage to her when it removes itself, and she had no healing in her own kit, you'd eventually end up handing talismans to other sinners, unless you spent resources, ego or support passives, on keeping Rodion at near max HP. As for if she's worth running now, it's somewhat debatable. She can't trigger Deathrite with any consistency, lacks synergy with the core Rupture IDs, and her infliction is bad now that Talis Claire is gone, but she does have better damage, better clashing, and irregardless of whether or not you deploy her, she has a better support passive. There's nothing relevant to bring up with the ego, you just run the good options anyway, but I'll be talking about Deviat Rodion again shortly. The next Rupture ID, and the last good one before Talisman's nerfs, is Sync Mer. As much as I dislike the visual design here, mechanically he's pretty solid, being effectively a prototype Mao ID, although with piss poor infliction and a far less important defense skill. Thankfully, he's got the good 15-3 conditional like Rodia, and has it on all 3 of his skills, meaning he just gets to ignore the stack the moment it's set up, and then use one of the most boring mechanics in the game, Focused Attack. Did you, when playing the other sync IDs, find that even after using your skill 3, you had too many options for where to target? Did you suffer from drawing your skill 3 too late, or having the coin that applies to that ID's version of Declared Duel get cracked? If so, don't worry, Sync Mer can fix it. Simply build up 2-owned Pride and 2-owned Gluttony, then use any non-ego attack. You'll get Focused Attack on that specific slot. Then, just have Mer repeat the process on the exact same slots. And to make things easier, the game even explicitly shows you which slots. The payoff for doing so is pretty damn good, as you can see, and made even better by being on a high coin count Mer ID, so regret gets its mention. But, given none of his ego are particularly special here, it seems like a good time to mention the old Rupture team, because the next 3 IDs aren't going to see any use in it. Simply put, you dual-slotted Rodion, put in the 2 good Rupture IDs, and then the least bad one. If you were worried about consistency, you just added another Glut Defense ID, or if you just wanted to maximise damage, you dual-slotted Mer or Don. It was a somewhat gimmicky team, given that if the boss didn't fold early, you'd lose the moment Rodion got to a 30+ courier stack, she'd be losing somewhere in the range of 40% HP and SP a turn, and it simply did nothing in normal encounters, but it was actually an effective way to get through a decent chunk of the Canto 7 bosses, most notably the Barber. Unfortunately, the team fell apart from there. Even discounting the nerfs to Talis Claire, the team would struggle with most bosses. Rodion would hit 30 courier at turn 6, and retreating would effectively just kill her. This also ignores the fact that Unbreakable spam would rapidly lead to Don getting handed the talismans instead after just a few turns, mandating that someone pop a healing ego to keep Rodion working. That said, however, Rupture is honestly better now than it ever was with Talisman, and there's only 2 slop IDs, and one that I have no clue how to evaluate, in the way. First is Fanghunt Honglu, who decided to try and fight with 7 Heath for his long vacant position. It takes a lot to be a worse version of a 12-month-old 00 ID, but by God Fanghunt tries his best. In fairness, against Blood Fiends, he tends to do a marginally better job than 7 Heath, but given that the trade-off is being one of the most count-negative IDs in the game, with clashing barely on curve even with his Rupture conditionals, it's a mercy that this ID can be entirely disregarded given how absurd his power creep was. Our next ID is roughly as bad, Deviat Sinclair. This ID probably looks great, right? High Rupture count, good clashing, good coin amount, absurd bonus infliction from courier. How could he be bad? Sure, if the target has a stack, he stops inflicting Rupture, but that's fine, it will just go neutral. Well, if this wasn't slightly edited, then yeah, he'd be an ID better than Deviat Rodion, and potentially have led to a world without Talis Claire nerfs. But that's not his 15-3 conditional, this is. The thing is, defense level down isn't even a bad debuff. and is on a fast ID as well. The problem is that not only does he not apply much, but it comes at the expense of actual infliction or sustain. I do not know at all why PM decided this was a good idea, because they can't have missed that Talus Glare was good, right? Frankly, this ID was insulting. He's got bizarre conditions that turn each other off, and worst of all, he forces me to issue a slight correction. It turns out Teacup Outers was not, in fact, the first post-launch ID to gain coin power to just 1 coin. Thanks, Sync. Lantern is odd, to say the least, and an ID that I think is majorly underutilised. He's got a lot of gimmicks, most of them aren't good, but he's greater than the sum of his parts. To lead, he's the last 15-3 ID, and has the incredible condition of literally nothing, except for 1 base power on the S3, and a marginally less insulting 3 on the count. By my best estimate, he was designed as a setup ID, who applies a 15-3 stack early, then dies once he'd stop inflicting Rupture, aided by his entirely unbreakable S1 and S2, along with being a tank with +0 defense level. As for the payoff for him dying, it's not too bad. You get 8 resources, focused on ones you own the least of, a 5-3 Rupture stack, 5 more Rupture if you had Fairy Lure, and speaking of which, up to 6 more Rupture if the target wasn't at 15-3 when they killed him. He's got unique sanity as well, with him gaining SP on clash loss and losing it on a win, presumably to keep him actually losing clashes, but in general it'll lock him around 10 SP either way, so he'll not be getting any consistency for heads or tails. His support lets other casualties after him also fuel more resources, but the biggest hurdle is to actually get him killed. The only real way to do it, aside from getting lucky with random indiscriminate attacks, is Ryo's Thoracalgia, although that is incredibly efficient at the job, given E's fatal weakness to slash and him having a Zion fatal surprise. I like this ID, and hopefully the bot guy gives him some more support in terms of getting himself killed. Do you run him on Rupture though? Honestly, it's a solid maybe. The only real condition to get value from him is just needing a number of backup sinners, and then not running another E-Song, which is hardly the end of the world. I don't, but if you're going for a Heishou cycle team, he's got a lot more value. Just remember to keep him at level 1. And then we reach the Heishou. I have a lot to say about these 9 foul creatures, but I'll be discussing each of them in their own banners first. The Maus are honestly absurd, and did a hell of a lot of a setup for Rupture, and these kits are hopefully reasonably self-explanatory. If not though, that's what I'm here for. I'll start with Autis, the marginally weaker one, although the differences are pretty minor. But before I do, I'll lead with the baseline for all Heishou kits. Heishou are most notable for their heavily standardised rotation. They all have a unique buff shed across the whole branch that they gain from their defence skills and skill 3s. This buff is usually vital to their game plan and leads to the incredibly consistent playstyle. Turn 1 defend, turn 2, 3 and 4 do whatever, and then when the buff runs out, defend again. The only part that tends to really differ across the branches is just whether or not the defence skill is on use or combat start. So, back to Autis, and she's got a fairly standard kit. Honestly, it's not too far off most prior Rupture IDs, with a single skill positive on count, and even a straight up negative S3, with the only unique part being her focus on going unopposed. This probably reads pretty bad, and it would be, if not for Deathrite Haste, the most overtuned effect Rupture ever had. Simply put, when you hit the target while at 10+ speed, you inflict 1 Rupture count and reduce the stack by 1. If this removes the stack, the target takes gluttony damage equal to their Rupture. This probably already sounds good, especially considering the fact that the Mao unique buff is 5 haste a turn, but it gets better. How much Deathrite Haste do you think a skill 3 inflicts? The 2 it says there? How about 6? For some reason, all the Mao S3s inflict 10 to 11 Rupture count, trigger Rupture 6 times, and can effectively bypass RNG on hitting that 10 speed, given their 4 to 7 speed ranges, 5 haste from Strider, and the last bit of haste if they used an S2 the prior turn. I could mention the fact that Autis gets even more damage from the passive, including that it'll always be at max for the S3, but that feels unnecessary. Heishou is effectively the same ID, except replacing all the unopposed conditionals with clash wins, and then taking a Rupture count off of the S2 to put it on the S1 and S3. Being count neutral on literally every skill, baseline, is absurd, and then followed up by the standard Mao S3 to absolutely dump count on the opponent is utter nonsense. I know I've not said much on Heishou, but the two are almost identical. There are differences, obviously, but nothing more than swapping around potency for count, a marginally different S1, and an extra coin power on the counter. They both have 2 coin S1s that have a reused coin at 10 plus speed, an S2 that applies count before any coins, then gains haste next turn, a 3 coin S3 that applies death right on the first coin, then reuses the last coin and reapplies death right at 10 plus speed, a passive that gives bonus damage while they have Strider and the target has death right, and a support passive that applies haste. Hell, they even have identical HP. The next pair is the CIDs, and we'll lead with the one that's got the least competition. Seagreg is one of the better designed hybrid IDs, given that both halves actually work, although it's still not enough to get him into the team proper. Serpentarm is a fairly simple buff, being a decent infusion of poise, potency and count each end step, though please remember it triggers after turn end decay, so a 1 count stack will still disappear. As with 90% of Rupture IDs, he's count negative on everything but the S3, although he has the notable upsides of Deathrite Venom, actually decent damage, good clashing, and a 4 coin S2 once he's gotten a little bit of setup, along with decent ego. Legerdemain is a great option, and at its best in Rupture, given the mountains of gluttony you generate, especially given you might actually be able to sustain maggots. Lantern still sucks, but you run it here anyway. AEDD has already been mentioned, but it's still good, and while Guards and Thorns is technically a Rupture ego, it still sucks. Run Unbrilliant if you can. As for Rodia, she's like Greg, except she gets a worse S3, no Deathrite, a marginally worse S1, and a slightly better S2. There's, again, not too much to say, although unlike Greg she does actually have competition in the aforementioned Deviat Rodion. I'll give you the rundown on which to run later, but neither is a bad choice on their respective teams. Her support passive, unlike Greg's, is actually pretty good, with it being nice set up for Honglu's S3, as opposed to this Thoracalgia bait. And finally, the big one, Mao Faust. You will probably know her as the new best ID, and while I feel some people overstate her value, I'm not contrarian enough to disagree with her spot as top 1. She's pretty universally good, and thankfully, an ID that is actually pretty mediocre when played with just win rate. As for the kit, it's standard Mao stuff by baseline, with the only difference being an extra coin on the counter and a non-gluttony S2. Things only get silly under the hood: assist defense, Tianju's blade, and Deathrite as a whole. Simply put, she takes the Heishou's obsession with consistency and goes up a level, using her unique resource in concert with assist defense to have near permanent access to her S3-2 once she does her setup. The existence of Tianju's is probably the reason no ID released after her had any flavour of Deathrite. PM didn't want to risk her having an even more consistent setup, although the fact that no ID after her is count neutral is a different issue. As for the S3-2, it's not actually all that overtuned. Obviously it's good, but there's a long list of IDs with better skill 3s, and even a very small list of IDs with more access to their S3. The difference? Not only does Faust effectively dual slot herself, but she also gets to actually clash with her S3 every turn, starting turn 4 at the latest. There's an exhaustive pile of restrictions, but it's all pretty easy to work around. Just let one person each turn be targeted by a normal attack, not unclashable or target fixed, and have them not use a defense skill. Yeah, it's that easy. With Faust's ego, there's a few to mention, starting with Lasso. It's an expensive piece given the 2 envy, and as per usual with non-war battle pass ego, pretty underwhelming. I mean, you'll run it irregardless here, the competition just isn't, but it's mainly just an upgrade to your S2 with an awful passive and corrosion. The Heishouslop is a bit more competitive, with 3 separate ego vying for use. Fluid Sac needs no actual elaboration, but is also the worst of the 3, given the obscene cost. So that leaves Thoracalgia and Command Meltdown. The two are pretty similar, with both having passives that slowly restore HP to allies throughout the fight, 3-weight AoEs, and pretty affordable costs. Command is the better option. It does more damage, heals HP and SP up front, doesn't rely on resonance for the passive healing, and likely most importantly, you can replace the lost poise, if you care, with Ryo's Thoracalgia. Command also has an actually good overclock, with a 5-weight 4-coin spread, for a pretty reasonable cost. Hardened Shell does have a tendency to disappear given unbreakables, but just not using Ego, which is honestly something Faust does anyway, keeps it around for a lot longer. If you lack Command, which is hardly a rare thing, then run Thoracalgia or Fluid. In most fights you won't use a Faust He anyway. I'm going to skip ahead momentarily to discuss the last member of the Core 4, Lord Honglu. He's also an obviously good ID, and the only Heishou related ID to not bore me to tears, despite him having pretty poor Rupture sustain. As for the kit, it's dense, and plenty is just almost entirely irrelevant, so I'll speed past the flavour nonsense like Lord's Guard and the entire list of bolus effects. His skills are all universally good, with standard rolls, relevant synergy, and some absolute nonsense, like completely unconditional extra damage on the S2, or pretty much any line on the S3. As for the S3, this thing could completely strip out 90% of the effects and still be cracked. All it needs is the Exalted Command for a Mao S3, with the rest just being a pile of nice bonuses, getting free damage, including 2 coins to ensure that even if the next skill applies Deathrite Haste you don't waste any, restoring SP on kill, applying a hefty debuff next turn if it fails to, and then also giving Hong a buff the first time he does it with each Heishou. The S3 only really comes up for MD, although there's probably someone who has an entire Heishou team get wiped, in which case it ends up being even better than anything Exalted Command could do. Next, his counter, because I really like it. Depending on how you built your team, this varies in role. From +2 power to your lowest health Heishou, to a better version of Captain Ish's S2 that heals the lowest health Heishou, then replaces them with one from the bench. This then has direct synergy with his main passive. When an ally subs in, they use the S1 next turn and heal 10 SP, and Heishou Jar IDs instead use the S3 and heal 20 SP. Continuing with that passive, it's also the only reason you'd actually consider running a full Heishou team, though given how annoying it is to read these all out, I've put them on the right. The important breakpoints, if you want to go full furry, are 4, 5 and 9 Heishou, with 4 capping min speed, 5 capping the majority of the relevant buffs, while also buffing every Heishou with a whole 1 offense level, and 9 capping the last relevant buff. Heishou 10 and 11, who don't exist yet, are just for fun. Finally, the passive rewards you for letting Heishou die, which will be brought up at the end, and gives him another damage buff for each bolus his S3 has given you. As for his resource passive, it's just a pile of buffs for his Tarnished Blood, and the standard self-revive ported from Ruiner, although one that applies an incredibly strict timer to him when it procs. This seems like a good segue, and one that justifies temporarily skipping the lower tier ego. Tarnished Blood is great. Much like Unbrilliant Glory, you spend a turn to set up a buff, in hopes that the fight goes long enough that you can get one of the single strongest attacks in the game. Unlike Unbrilliant, however, the cost for the first use is pretty substantial. The buff puts every Hong ID but Lord on a timer, the actual buff itself is relevant, and the corrosion is utter garbage. It's a great ego, and it's at its best in Rupture, even ignoring the ways Lord abuses it. Faust really wants IDs to be targeted by one-sided attacks without guarding, and using unclashables on an enemy skill slot is the easiest way to do that. Lasso is way less impressive, but still good. It's a cheap 2-weight 4-coiner, and one that can either set up or pay off a stack pretty well. Most of the debuffs are irrelevant, the passive is bad, and the corrosion is never worth the SP cost, but it's a good ego. As for He's, once again we have 3 to talk about. Effervescent is the cheapest, Dimension Shredder is the only one that actually applies decent count, and To Remain Oneself is a resource generator with good weight, a trivially low cost, and one of the best rewards for ego spam in the game. Run anything but Effervescent if you can get away with it. Shredder and Remain are just both excellent options. Going back slightly, Ish gets a bad rep. She's not great, but her main issue is being the ID released right after Mao Faust, and then being followed up by the Thumb IDs. Any ID shorter than Magical Girls releasing there would have been mocked, and Zeichin at least has the upsides of not being a complete joke like the Ncorp IDs. Unfortunately, I just don't have much to say about her in a general Rupture team. Her best aspect is being able to sub out on the Heishou team every 3 turns, which gives her a slight niche as a way to throw out even more S3s, but once again, I'll bring it up at the end. Just 4 Heishou IDs left, and not one is great, but they're worth mentioning. Wei Sang is the first, and still isn't worth actually running, considering he's one of the most battle cruiser IDs we've ever gotten. Not only is he incredibly speed range reliant, but he also needs to pop an ego, activate his passive, build up his max stacks, and then never use his S3 after that point, all on a Heishou, meaning he needs his defense skill buff to actually be consistent. The payoff is decent, being an ID that can actually run reasonably well for Rupture, on top of providing concussion. I would legitimately run him in content where you don't get to dual slot, but outside of that, he's no Mao. The UIDs suck, with Unfocused Volley being one of the worst debuffs a skill can have. Targets randomly is genuinely better. They're technically better in burn, but that's saying literally nothing. Why would you run an ID with no relevant ego, majorly count negative skills, a self-harm gimmick with an awful payoff, and 0 redeeming qualities? Okay, that's an exaggeration. The two of them aren't awful, with both of them having the niche of good S3s to cycle within the Heishou team. Because they have weight, even with unfocused, they're pretty rewarding in human fights to swap around, especially with Heath's self-inflicted damage to make swapping him in and out easier. Sync needs to be slightly lower levelled, around 54, if you want him to work with a full Heishou team, which is the best way to use Rupture outside of focused encounters. Finally, thank God, Wei Don is our last Heishou, hopefully for a while. I almost want to call her good, given her pretty high damage, Shattermark being an easy to apply panic change and effective fragile, and sinking almost always being a decent splash, just to help with clashing. On a Heishou team, she should generally be one of your on-field IDs, given that she can chunk through health bars pretty consistently. Her issue is being a strictly count-negative ID, who therefore struggles to reach and sustain her coin power conditionals. If you can actually sustain a Rupture or sinking stack, she does become a reasonable payoff for it, so there's some argument to running her there as the 5th ID. I don't think that's correct, but I'll admit I'd mostly written her off before starting this video, so I've not tested her there too much. As for the Heishou as a whole, I'm not a fan, if you somehow couldn't tell. They're arguably too visually consistent, to the point where even the N-Corp Fnatic IDs had more visual differences, and the same is true mechanically. Every Heishou from a branch, with the exception of Faust, is near identical to its pair. This is more pronounced for some branches, but even the most diverse only differ in minor 2-word changes. What this does, however, is let Heishou be incredibly easy to learn, while ensuring they still actually work. Universally, they have on-curve kits, with the sole outlier being Euclair, and due to their tight-knit faction design, it's effectively a pre-made pick-up-and-play team. You can moan about it all you want, like I'm doing right now, but Heishou are the first, and currently only, viable, non-status archetype. Before you comment Blade Lineage, Mer did nothing to salvage the bad IDs, same with KK-ish. N-Corp was even worse, the middle is a joke, and everything else is either 2 IDs or has no actual synergy. And with that out of the way, we reach our last ID, Drifter Ryoshu. This ID's had a bit of a debate, with people either calling her trash for being worse than Mao Ryoshu, correct for having better potency than Mao, or people saying that she's a side grade. In practice, she's worse on a pure Rupture team, but ironically, better on a Heishou team. This might sound stupid, but I can explain. Her kit is subpar, especially compared to Mao. Her clashing is worse, as is her damage, and she's unable to sustain her poise long term without ego usage. She plays like a gimped KK Heath for some reason. Her S1 follow-up has a far easier activation condition but much less rewards, and as others have pointed out, is somewhat inconsistent given clashable defense skills, assist defense, and just not having much payoff early. Her worst aspect is just being entirely agnostic to the design of the Heishou, and even her own kit. She has little synergy with the good Heishou, her payoff for letting low health allies die doesn't work if she kills them, despite having the best tool to do that, and despite having an obscenely tanky stat line with Protector stance, enabling it means allies are unlikely to get hit to trigger the S3, which for some inexcusable reason is OPE. Obviously she's better in MD, but there's no reason to drop Mario for this in actual content. Just wait till Blind Obsession gets up to 5 to keep her juiced on poise forever. That's all the IDs, so here's the little surprise. There's actually 3 teams this time. The one at the start was merely the best for story content, but even that's only good for focused encounters, as hopefully I've already made clear. I've also got this one, which is just a win rate plus Honglu counter Heishou spam team for clearing the human fights, and then this one for railways, given you can't dual slot there. Assuming you're doing RR1 botgak, pick between these two based on vibes. Wu-Seng is just there for any theoretical fights that have a 7th slot, though it did help for last night when he existed. That said, I do have quite a few closing thoughts, so if you don't mind. Rupture, as limited as the top end is, does have plenty of actual options. Using Greg's AEDD into Roger's S3 to set up a +4 stack, running lower level Heishou to sack to Ryo's Thora Calgia for buffs to Honglu and multiple free S3s, playing to just cycle through Heishou, and even some really gimmicky stuff with the older IDs. The issue is why bother? The 4 to 5 man team just gets to output so much damage, has incredible resource generation, and effectively always operates at its best. Rupture spent literal years as an inconsistent gimmicky mess that could occasionally deal some of the highest damage turns in the game. Now, it's a team with near perfect consistency, while still retaining similarly high per turn damage. I've seen some arguments that Rupture would arguably be in a healthier state if they'd nerfed Malfaust instead of Talisman, and I couldn't agree less. Outside of nerfing Deathrite Haste to a similar level as the rest of the Heishou, Mao would still be ran, she'd just be more focused on potency than count. The issue with Rupture at its core is that it's always been a team with a vast majority of its strength in 1 or 2 IDs, a couple decent count neutral IDs, and then multiple pieces of garbage that get ignored. The people who say nonsense like that should just be entirely disregarded. If PM releases bad Rupture IDs, or Rupture IDs that don't help with the key issues the team has, it won't make Rupture weaker, they'll just be left unsharded while the team remains as good as it was before. And as for that whole sharding thing, good luck my guy. Literally every relevant piece, bar the first 2 Maos, are locked behind the current season. Once we get to Kanto 10 then the order is just the same as deployment, but for now, if you don't have all the pieces, you're SOL. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Current plan for my next video is to review every single ID that got released last year and didn't get into a video already, or in the case of hybrids, who missed one of their videos, and keep that up as an annual occurrence. I'm clearly not fast enough to get one out on time for every new ID, so until I actually finish that, have a good one.